Hi there, I'm Marcie Billen here in Norman, Oklahoma. I'm a real estate agent with Keller Williams and Team Realty. So we help a ton of people move into Oklahoma from out of state, typically from places like California, Washington State, Colorado, Texas, all these different places. And questions that I typically get is, what's the weather like? So today we're going to talk to a meteorologist to see if he can answer some of your questions about what the weather is actually like in Oklahoma from a professional standpoint. If you are moving to Oklahoma or thinking about it, I have a relocation guide that you can download for free. That information is below in the description. So go ahead and click that link and see if any of that information will be helpful to you. All right, David, thank you so much for joining us today. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do and why you're the one to talk to us about weather today?
Oh, yes. Thank you so much for having me today. I've been a meteorologist and interested in weather my entire life.
Nice.
I worked for the National Weather Service for 33 years as a forecaster and a supervisor. I retired in 2011. And since that time, I've been teaching weather at colleges. I've also been working with FEMA, going out doing weather classes that way. And also I work with help in law cases when lawyers need weather experts.
Okay, that makes sense. Well, very cool. Well, I get a ton of questions from my clients as a realtor about what the weather is like in Oklahoma, especially if they're moving in from out of state. So, of course, the number one question I typically get is, what is tornado season? Can you tell us about that?
Yes, tornado season in Oklahoma is generally from March through May. But if you get the right conditions, you can have a tornado almost any time of the year. But most of the tornadoes occur in the months of March, April, and May.
Okay. All right. Awesome. All right. So I get a lot of questions about where tornadoes hit. Of course, everyone sees on YouTube that the Moore tornado in 2013 is, most of the footage that we have. So where do tornadoes actually hit in Oklahoma, would you say?
Tornadoes can occur all across the state of Oklahoma, especially during the spring months. Here in Cleveland County, we average about one tornado per year. In the last 70 years, there's average about one tornado per year.
Okay.
Now, if you think about that, we had over 25,000 days since 1950.
Mm-hmm.
In that time, we've only had 5 days that had tornado fatalities.
Okay.
In 1999 and 2013, we had 2 big tornadoes in Moore, Oklahoma, and that gets most of the attention. But those are very rare, and those do not occur often at all here in Oklahoma or in Cleveland County.
Okay. Wow. No, that's really good information. Thank you. Okay. So tell me a little bit about Norman then with tornadoes. Like you talked about more, obviously we know that 1999 and 2013 were huge years for that. So what about Norman? How often does Norman get tornadoes?
Well, in Norman, if you look at either city, either Norman or Moore, you're probably looking at a tornado somewhere in the city limits once every 5 to 10 years. But 90% of those tornadoes have winds less than 110 miles per hour, so they don't usually make the news, and they usually don't do that much damage.
Okay, so just for reference, how fast were the winds in the 2013 Moore tornado?
In the 2013 Moore tornado, the winds were around 200 miles per hour.
Okay.
On the F scale, that rated as a 5, EF5. We also had an EF5 in the Moore tornado in 1999. Okay. But those tornadoes at that level, less than 2% of all tornadoes are in that level of those type of tornadoes, of that range of tornadoes. So those are very rare tornadoes, not just in Oklahoma, but across the entire country.
Okay. So if a tornado does occur, what time of the day is typical for that?
Here in Oklahoma, in central Oklahoma especially, most tornadoes will occur between 1 and 2 p.m. in the afternoon till 10 p.m. at night.
Okay.
We're very fortunate here in central Oklahoma that overnight tornadoes are very rare. Usually it's just a late afternoon, early evening phenomena.
So, of course, we have tornado sirens here in Oklahoma. In Norman, we have a test every day, every Saturday at noon. So, how much time do we get from when the sirens go off to the actual tornado, if it were to hit you, would you say?
The average lead time from when a warning is issued to the time the tornado actually occurs is 13 minutes. But
13
that
minutes.
varies depending on the storm. The weaker tornadoes usually have shorter lead time. In other words, it might only be a couple of minutes because they don't have a very good indication on radar. The stronger tornadoes usually have a lot more lead time, like 15 to 30 minutes before the tornado actually strikes a given location.
Gotcha. And that makes sense for me. Like I was very close to the 2013 Moore tornado where it started in Newcastle. And I had time to literally walk across a Walmart parking lot and go into Walmart and into the back of the store before we even had sight of it. So that makes sense. Okay.
Yes. And of course, when it first develops, sometimes radar might not have a very good indication. So we have storm spotters who will call it into the weather service and can issue a warning based on someone seeing the developing signs of a tornado.
Okay. How strong are most tornadoes in Oklahoma? Like the vast majority?
Most of the tornadoes, 90%, will have winds less than 110 miles per hour. We call that EF1 or 0 on the Fujita scale.
Okay.
So most of the tornadoes will be of the weak variety. Only 2% will be of the EF4, EF5 variety. So out of 100 tornadoes in Oklahoma, we would expect no more than 2 to be the high-end EF4, EF5 tornado.
So tell us a little bit about tornado shelters. Will those totally protect you from the tornadoes?
Yes, if the tornado shelters are built by a reputable company, and there's many of them here in Oklahoma, and they follow the FEMA guidelines, those shelters will protect you from any tornado, even the EF5 tornadoes. Okay. Here in Oklahoma, most of the tornado shelters are now built in garages.
Yes.
So it doesn't take up any more square footage in the house, and they're easy to get in and easy to get out of. So yes, a tornado shelter will totally protect you from any tornado, even the EF5 here in Oklahoma.
All right, so tell us a little bit about hail. How often do we get hail? What kind of damage does that wreak on Oklahoma?
Here in central Oklahoma, we probably will have 2 or 3 storms that will probably produce some type of hail usually in the spring, maybe early summer months. Okay. The hail, majority of the time, is the size of a dime or smaller. Mm-hmm. There are some instances, especially on tornado days, where the hail is golf ball to baseball size. Having that size hail at any one location probably occurs maybe once every 3 to 5 years. Oh, so there is that possibility. It is a higher probability in western Oklahoma than it is in eastern Oklahoma. And central Oklahoma is right on the borderline between the giant hail to the west and not as big hail to the east. So here in Norman, probably once every 3 to 5 years, the possibility of getting maybe golf ball size hail.
Okay, so what about flooding in Oklahoma? How would I know if we'd have flood issues wherever I was planning to move to in Oklahoma? How would I check that out?
Well, most of the flooding. Norman in Oklahoma is mostly flat, at least in central Oklahoma. So most of our water is what I would call severe pondy. Instead of big flash floods like we see in other parts and more where the terrain is more varied, our water just tends to spread out. The most significant flooding occurs near creeks, rivers, and in low-lying areas. Okay. And FEMA has a map that shows the floodplains in areas where it floods here in Norman or in any location you want to look in the United States. So that would be the place to look to see if you're in a floodplain and also to see how close you might be to a floodplain. And those maps are updated on a regular basis. Because as you build more homes or you put it down more concrete, that could change the floodplain. So the best way to know is to look at some of the FEMA maps that show where the floodplain is located.
Okay, perfect. And yeah, I look at a FEMA map for almost every single house that I sell to make sure the client knows where the floodplain is in relationship to their house. So Yeah.
That's great. And I think that's very important when you buy a home.
All right, tell us about hurricanes. What effect do we get here in Oklahoma from hurricanes that may have entered the Gulf?
Okay, hurricanes, as they move inland, they typically, when we think of hurricane, we think of strong winds.
Right.
And as they come inland, they're being fed by the ocean, but once they come inland, they lose that feed. So what happens is the hurricane winds will decrease very rapidly. So before a hurricane can get to Oklahoma, it has to go through Texas. So if a hurricane was to come up through Texas, by the time it got to Oklahoma, the winds would be much weaker. We still probably might have 30 to 40 mile per hour winds, but nothing like what you would see down on the Gulf Coast or near the coast. The main threat from the hurricane would be heavy rains and potential flooding. If it's a real slow moving system, then there would be a greater potential for flooding. So that would be the main effects we would see from hurricanes, would be heavy rain and possible flooding.
All right, so tell us a little bit about fires then. Do we get a lot of wildfires here in Oklahoma, and how does that affect us?
Surprisingly, we do get wildfires in Oklahoma, especially if we've had a long-term drought. We're way below on rainfall. And then in the spring or in the fall, you get some real windy days. And a fire gets started, then it can spread pretty quickly.
Wow.
Now, those fires are generally mostly grassland fires or shorter brush or trees. So they don't have quite the fuels that we see out in the Western United States. So they can burn a lot of area, but they're not usually nearly as intense or last as long as the ones that we see normally in the Western United States, which have much more forests and much more fuels to burn out of control than they do here in Oklahoma. So yes, we have wildfires, but they're not the same type of wildfires that we see in the Western United States.
Would you say that those wildfires are more typical in areas that are more rural?
Mostly they are. They're outside the city. We have had some in central Oklahoma, close to the cities, but those have been much more rare than grassland fires, mainly in western Oklahoma.
All right, so we've talked a lot about central Oklahoma and western Oklahoma, but we haven't really touched on eastern Oklahoma. Is the terrain very different from eastern Oklahoma to western Oklahoma?
Well, as you go from central Oklahoma into eastern Oklahoma, the rainfall is progressively more. There's more rain. So central Oklahoma averages about 30 to 33 inches of rain a year. As you get into far eastern Oklahoma, it's closer to 50 inches a year.
Oh.
So there's a little bit more flooding. They do have a little bit more maybe severe weather, but it's usually not as intense as we see in western Oklahoma.
Oh.
You can also get wildfires in eastern Oklahoma. There's more trees, but usually they have such a wetter climate that it's much rarer in eastern Oklahoma than it is in central or western Oklahoma.
Okay. Thanks so much for watching our video today about Oklahoma weather. I really appreciate it. Remember, I have that relocation guide linked in the description below. And if you haven't hit subscribe, go ahead and do that so you don't miss anything.